Hello. So now we'll try um to make an HTTP request with a user input. So first, let's create a new component called ng generate component http-user-input. Oh, let's open the project first in integrated terminal, then ng generate component http-user-input. Then let's access our TypeScript file, and um, in our TypeScript file, we will basically create a method to get the user from the API that we accessed earlier. Get user, and then void this.http, but we still don't have the injection for the HTTP, so private http client, and okay. Now we can now access the get method and then access the API JSON placeholder dot typicode.com slash users slash plus the variable that we're gonna bind in our HTML document. So first we need to create the variable first. So let's say ID is in a type of any, and then after that we will subscribe to this get method. Wait, and after subscribing on it, we'll store the collection of the data from the API into this dot users is equals to data, and let's create a variable called users with a type of any. Okay, now we created the method, and let's go to our HTML file and save it. And let's create a div with a class of container, and then create a CSS to center this container, display, flex, align item center, justify content center, and go back to the HTML and create a card row div dot column and save it. And in here we will create a div that will have a header tag of search user, and then it will have a input input with the class of form control, and then let's bind it ng model to our ID. The ng model is not existing in our app module, so let's import first the forms module. Okay, and then import it into our imports array, and then save it. Okay, now we can add a button with a class of button primary. Then let's label this or name this search user, and it will have a type of submit, and it will basically access the method that we created, and then save it. And then as you can see, now our input is ready, and I will add a div that will display the users that we accessed. So user ID is users dot id. Okay, and then going back to our input, we basically created the users already, so this is fine. And then let's close the p tag and create another p tag that will hold the user's name, users possible to be null. So we add the question mark, p tag address, users dot address, and then let's add a directive in here, ngIf is equals to users, and then let's run our server and see if our method works. Just click yes. Then now the port or the server is running. Let's access it, and in our browser it's still like the old code that we made. So let's comment this out first and just simply add okay, and then going back to our server, it's now basically showing search user, but I guess we still didn't add a bootstrap in here, so let's add it later when we create a new method. So let's say we inputted here ID of 1. It's gonna basically give you the user ID with the name Leon Graham, but the address is still object because we still need to access one more variable inside the address array in our API. So let's add here example is city. Then when we save it and then go back in here again, so if we search ID, now it's gonna give us the address and the city. Basically, this is another way of using a user input in order to display some data from your API. And then let's stop the server first and let's install the bootstrap, and then let's paste the script in our angular.json. So let's save it and import the bootstrap in our styles.css. Then save it. Okay, and let's try to run our server again. And then basically now it's looking better. So let's try to search user ID with the ID of 3. It's gonna basically give me the details for the user with the ID of 3 in our API. And let's proceed to another method that we can always use by printing all the data on your API or all the data that you can get. So for example, you want to print all all the users in your API. So let's create a method called get all users with a type of void, and then this dot http dot get. Let's just copy this same link. Let's just copy this and paste it here. And then we don't basically need to add a ID in here because we want to display all the users in our API. So let's just transform the data into a map, into an array. So let's say the response is any type of any, and then this will return the response and map it in a array with in an array of um, user that has the attributes of ID, the type of any, name, name with a type of any, and email with a type of any. And this will basically be returned in our variable id user.id, then name user.name, and email user.email. And we just need to save it, and let's add some closings in here, and then we just need to separate this so that it's going to look good. And after mapping our data in our user, after mapping all the data that we get from this API, we can now then subscribe to that array so that it will be transferred and it will be held in a array variable that we want. But first, we need to import this map from the XJS operators. So let's import it, then save it, and then let's subscribe to the map that we created or to the array that we created. So dot subscribe and data with a type of any array, and then we will basically store this into a variable. Let's create a variable called users2 with a type of any. This dot users2 is equals to the data that we collected, users2. Okay, and then let's save it. So basically in this method, we use the HTTP method get in order to get the data in this API, and then we converted the data, or we used the pipe in order to convert the data into an array and map those data inside our customized array, wherein that array contains the attributes of the user, wherein the user has an attribute of ID, name, and email. And then after accessing method, this method will basically return the ID, the name, and the email, and will be stored or will be collected using the subscribe observable into our variable any. And after storing the data in our variable data, it will also be stored into our custom variable, or like the global variable that we created. Then we can basically now access it in our HTML file. So after that, let's try to create another div. So basically what we're going to do is under this um, div with ngF, we're gonna create a new div with a class of just simple margin top of 5 so that it will be adjusted. Then add an h4 tab called get all users. Then save it. And then add a button with a class of button dash primary. Then add a function of click get all users is get all users, or let's just copy it. Okay. So the button will have a label called get all users, and then we will now then create a new div in order for us to display the data inside that array. So let's use the ng4 directive to display all the data inside that array. Let data of users 2, and then let's create a p tag id data dot id and save it, and then p tag again. Or maybe we can copy and paste this. 1, 2. Let's change this label into name, then change this to email, and instead of data.id, this is going to be data.email, and this is data.name. Then let's check our HTML. Then after that, after clicking this, it's basically gonna display all the data in our API. Wherein it's only 10 items or 10 individuals that has their data in this API. As you can see, when we like search here for the ID of one, it's basically giving us the same name, but we didn't put the email here, so it's a we it's not necessary to put it, but in here we're basically getting the ID, the name, and the email, and it matches to the user ID one that we access using a specific ID in our API. Then next, what we're going to do is we're gonna create a method, post method for adding a new data. So let's post new with a type of void, and constant body is equivalent to user ID is equals to this dot user ID, but we still don't have this variable, so we still have to create this user ID with a type of any. And then in here we're getting an error on that, but let's figure it out later. So okay, now the error is gone. Then we'll add title, this dot title, but it's still not existing too. Body, this dot body, and then in here let's just basically add a new variable, and then it will be fine. And then after that, we're gonna create a headers equals to new http headers, and has a content type of application slash JSON. Then let's just save it. And then after creating this variables or body and header that we need, we will now use the HTTP post method in order to send a data to our JSON placeholder dot typecode dot com slash posts, and let's add the body and the headers. Then we will use the subscribe observable and store the data that we collected into our this dot um, post is equals to data, but we still don't have the post variable. So let's create a post variable with type of any. Okay. Now basically this post variable will store the data that we sent in this endpoint using the body and the headers. After the observable collected it, it will basically just store the data that it collected in the variable that we also created. So after that, let's go back to our HTML document and create a new div. Okay, so let's create a new div in here under the card. Okay, let's create a div with a class of card with a margin at the right at its x-axis of 2, then div.row, div.column, then add a header tag. Let's say add new post, and then after that, let's create a div with a class of column, and let's create a input. Let's create a input with a class of form control, and it's going to be binded in our variable call the user ID, and it will have an ID of user ID. We'll have a label for user ID. Label is user ID. Okay. Now we binded this input field into our user ID variable so that after we submit the data, it's just gonna automatically store and it's gonna be automatically sent using our HTTP post method. Then after that, let's add a new input tag, but this time it won't be user ID, it's going to be title. Then this is going to be for title, the ID for the input is title, and the variable in the ng model is just gonna be title. And then let's add a new one again. This one is going to be the body, and then this one is for the body. ID is body, and the variable is body. But I guess it's better if we change this into a text area. Let's just close it. Okay, and save it. And then we'll add a button with a type of submit and has a class of button dash primary and has a method of click call accessing the method post new. So basically our variables are dependent on what does the data type in our API looks like. For example, if we access this typico.com/post, so let's say we access it, you can see that it's basically user ID, title, and body. So in here, it's user ID, title, and body. I didn't put the ID because I know that the ID is gonna be automatically generated every time you add a new data. Like for example, like the Facebook user counts adds the value for its counter after you register and create a new account. So it's basically also the same in the in some backend APIs. So as a practice, we don't have to add the ID for this API. So as you can see, as you notice, it's user ID and user ID um with uh title and body. So these variables are basically dependent on the data types in your JSON data in the API that you're trying to access. But going back in here, let's add a name for our button in here called enter post. And then after that, let's add a div tag to display the data that we tried to add or we tried to create it. Add a directive ng if is equals to post and then p tag again for user ID for user ID and interpolate that post. We add question mark because this user ID might be null. Dot user ID and then p tag again for post ID. Then post dot ID. You basically notice that even if we didn't add a variable for the ID, we are still able to access it because it exists in the API as its attribute. And then add another p tag for title, post dot title, and then again p tag again for body, post dot body. Okay, now let's save it and try to do it in our server. So let's say the user that will add this post is 12, and then the title is seashells. Let's just add the body for she sells seashells by the seashore. Then we enter the post. then it's basically gonna display, or it's gonna give us that it's gonna tell us that we basically successfully inserted a data on our API, but the data's post ID now is 101 because it has already 100 items on it. Then this might be the 101 data that was inserted in our API. Then after that, after the post method, we're gonna create a put data, put data, and then void. And same as this, let's just copy this constant body, and then let's try to change this constants. Let's try to remove this and change it into name. This dot name, but we still don't have the variable name in here, so let's just add name any, and let's add one more attribute called email. This dot email, and save it. But we also don't have the email, so email with the type of any. And we're gonna create a header, new HTTP headers. Content type is application slash JSON, and oh, we're missing a open open parenthesis in here. Okay, and then let's add a HTTP method called put, wherein basically we will try to update the data on a specific ID depending to the user input. HTTP slash JSON placeholder dot typico.com slash posts slash plus this dot put ID, but we don't have the put ID yet, so let's just create another variable in here. Okay, now it exists, and after that we will add the body and the headers, and save it, and then we will subscribe to this put method and collect the data, and we'll basically store the collected data into the variable that we created. This dot, oh, it's put data, but we don't have the put data yet, so yeah, I'm just gonna put it back again to data for the put method. So data put, and then let's just remove this. Okay. Basically, in this method, we created a put method that will access this API with respect to the user input for the ID, and will be collected, and the data is gonna be collected using the subscribe observable, and after collecting it, those data are also gonna be stored to our variable that we created called data put. And then going back to our HTML document, we're gonna create another card after this card, div that card, and div dot row, div dot column. Then let's put a header tag here, put details, for example, and then create a div, and then let's just put a label on this, and then create a input field, okay, with a class of form control, and it's gonna be binded to our put ID, and the ID is just ID. For ID, let's copy this, let's put a label first, ID, and then paste it. Let's say this is now for our name, and let's just change the variable we binded into name and label it as name, and copy it again. Now it's for the email, and the variable that we are gonna bind is the email, and the ID now is email. Then after that, after creating the input, we will create a button that will submit this data. So type is submit, and class is button dash primary with a margin top of 2, and then it will just basically execute the put data method, and we'll have a label of submit. And after that, let's create a div that will display the values that we inserted. Let's just add a directive of ngif data put. Okay, and then p tag for name, data put, maybe null, so we add a question mark dot name, and then p tag for email, data put, might be null for email, and let's save it, and let's check on our server. So for example, we want to change the details or the name and the email on the user ID, that what on the first user ID. Then let's add John Doe, and the email is going to be John Doe at example.com. And then if I submit it, it's gonna basically tell me that the name and email for John Doe is now updated, and our put command is working, and it got the data in our API, and it also stored the data in that API, and all of those data that was collected in the API was now stored to our this dot data put variable. So to summarize, basically in a get method, we can get a specific data with respect to one of its attribute. It might be the name, it might be the ID, or it might be the email address, or etc. But we have to bind that variable first in order for it to work properly with respect to the user's input. And we can also get all the data and use a pipe. But we're gonna discuss this further in the future. But for now, pipe allows us, or is converting the API data into a much more applicable data, wherein it's gonna be arrays, and after that we can map that data into a variable that we created with a type of any, and then basically we can tell it to return a mapped response with respect to the attributes that we created, wherein the attributes in this example is user with a attribute of ID, name, and email. Then after returning that response, it will also return again the values for the ID, name, and email. And we can now collect those data in an array because we mapped it using the RxJS operator. We can now subscribe on it and get the data and store it into an array. And then after that, we can now store this array into a variable that we created so that we can use it to access the data in our array using the HTML document and display it on the user interface. Wherein in post and put data, basically the difference of post and put is just the post just adds a new data, and it just depends on the API if it is incrementing. So example, like what I said earlier, it didn't put a post ID in here because that post ID is incrementing, or the API um has has a code on it that it just copies the previous values, or maybe it might increment after 5 items, and etc. Basically in here we just created a body that will hold the data that the user will input, and then created a header with a to specify the type, that we're about to send, and then just call the post method and access the API and send the data that we want to send with, and also um, told the API that we're about to send a JSON data, and subscribed on it again, collected the data, and stored it to our data, uh, and stored the data to the variable that we created. Wherein in um, the put method, we just it's just basically same as post, but we can insert a data on a specific user by specifying its ID, and then again tell the API that we're about to send a JSON format. And in this logic, or in this line of code, after sending it, we collected those data and we tried to display it on our user interface to tell the user that this data is successfully sent. So now, as for practice for you, I want you to practice in creating the patch method and the delete method. Um, Tip: patch is just basically the same as put, but you just need to change one specific attribute. And delete is just basically you're gonna delete a specific user, so you also have to specify the user ID. So I guess you have to create a ID again for the delete method. And that will be all for HTTP methods and observables in Angular. And see you in the next following videos. Thank you and goodbye.